on a morning in 1756. The only sound piercing the silence of the Moscow streets was the wheels of a carriage fading into the distance with the dawn. Neighbors who cautiously opened their doors would never forget what they saw that day. A young female servant lay on the ground, her skin flayed, her scalp peeled off. No one understood, but this was only the beginning, because this girl was the first victim of one of Russia's most terrifying women. Her name was Daria Saltykova, a countess, a widow, and a monster hidden in plain sight. She was not a killer lurking in dark alleys. She was a wealthy, devout, respected noblewoman. On her vast estates near Moscow, she owned more than 600 serfs. Legally, they all belonged to her, but in Daria's eyes, they were merely prey. Official records documented 38 murders, but researchers suggest the true count could be 138. This is the story of how a woman who prayed in the presence of God descended into a reign of inhuman terror, a terror so profound that even Empress Catherine II was eventually forced to intervene. Daria was a woman who derived pleasure from pain, and her crimes condemned her to decades in a windowless cell in absolute darkness. But before reaching that point, everything had begun with a story of privilege. Welcome to the dark corners of the past. Forgotten stories and hidden secrets await you here. Like, subscribe, and join us on this journey. Daria Nikolaevna Ivanova was born in Moscow in 1730. Wealth, status, education, everything was at her fingertips. She belonged to one of the most elite families. And like all Russian nobility of that era, she learned from a young age to view serfs, known as souls, not as human beings, but as property. These people, bought, traded, and punished, were no different from animals to their masters. This system fostered cruelty. In the hands of someone like Daria, it would become lethal. But in her youth, no one feared her. She was regular at church services, donated to monasteries, and was held up as an exemplary noble lady. No one could see the darkness within her. In 1750, at the age of 20, Daria married Gleb Elizabeth Saltykov, a captain in the Imperial Guards. The Saltykov family was one of Russia's most powerful dynasties. With this marriage, Daria's immunity grew as much as her fortune. She quickly gave birth to 2 children, Theodore and Nicholas. For a time, everything seemed ordinary. A mother, a wife, a noblewoman. Until the year 1755. Her husband, Gleb, suddenly died. Daria was only 25, and in an instant, she became the sole owner of over 600 serfs and 2 vast estates. Now, no one could say no to her. And at that moment, the real Daria emerged. She was no longer in her husband's shadow, but the absolute ruler of her own domain. Her first victim was a servant who made a small mistake in the house. Daria beat her to death, but she felt no remorse that night. On the contrary, she enjoyed it. And from that moment on, she did not stop. The murders became increasingly systematic. Daria used different methods of torture on each victim, as if performing an art. She branded some with hot irons, made others stand barefoot in the snow in winter and watch them freeze. She scalded some with boiling water, and then beat them to death. Even children were not spared. She murdered an 11-year-old girl by pushing her down stone stairs, and watched with cold composure as she burned the hair of another young woman, listening to her screams. And after a while, even watching others suffer was no longer enough. She forced her serfs to torture each other. Husbands were compelled to beat their wives in front of her. Those who refused faced even more horrifying ends. Every day, a new punishment, a new victim, and for Daria, a new source of pleasure. One of the most chilling cases involved Onysia Grigorova, a pregnant servant. Daria used her power and connections to silence them all. The accusers were arrested or driven out of their villages. Investigations were closed with orders from above, and the Countess continued her reign of terror as if nothing had happened. She was untouchable, or so it seemed. But in 1762, everything changed. The cry for justice finally reached the throne. After years of silence, The victims' families made a brave decision. They bypassed the system, which was rotten with corruption, and appealed directly to the newly crowned Empress, Catherine II, for help. Catherine was a young ruler still, trying to solidify her power. She wanted to portray herself as the voice of justice and reform. And when the allegations about Daria Saltykova came before her, she did not ignore them like the others. She issued the command, uncover the entire truth. This would be unlike any investigation the Russian Empire had ever seen. For the first time, the state acted against a noble. A massive investigation began, lasting 6 years. Officials searched every corner of Daria's estate, talking to hundreds of witnesses. Over 300 people gave testimony. What they recounted was blood-curdling. Serfs spoke of beatings, burnings, mutilations, and murders. Neighbors told of seeing bodies wrapped in blankets being carried out at night. Some recalled hours of continuous screaming. Evidence slowly accumulated, revealing a horrifying picture. Daria was not killing secretly. She was killing knowing she was safe. And the system had protected her for years. Officially, 138 victims. But finding proof for each was difficult, because those killed were poor, uneducated serfs. Many did not even have graves. Only whispers remained. Nevertheless, authorities were able to indisputably prove 38 murders. And this was more than enough to bring her to trial. In the face of judgment, Daria had only one answer. I don't know. I did nothing. She repeated these words many times. But this time, no one believed her. Now, the matter was not just a crime, but a dilemma, because Catherine II faced a dead end. Daria was guilty, yes, but she was a noble. Russia had abolished the death penalty in 1754, 8 years before that time. Moreover, executing a countess could instill fear among the nobility and even shake the throne. The empress had to find a balance. The punishment had to be permanent, humiliating, but politically safe. And she found it. In 1768, Daria Saltykova was brought before the public in Moscow's Red Square. Chained, she stood on a raised platform. A wooden plaque around her neck read, "This woman tortured and murdered." For an hour, thousands of people stared at her. Some shouted, some simply fell silent. Everyone wanted to believe that justice had finally been served. But this was only the beginning. After the spectacle, Daria was taken to the Ivanovsky Monastery in Moscow. A special cell was prepared for her, windowless, dark, a dungeon surrounded by stone walls. She remained there for years. She was forbidden to speak, to go outside, or even to see the sun. A nun brought her food every day. She was not allowed to speak to anyone else. From 1768 to 1779, she lived in darkness for 11 full years. The woman who once held hundreds of lives in her hand was now reduced to her own shadow. Silence replaced power. In the darkness, she vanished step by step. Daria Saltykova's world turned into an endless night for over a decade. The only thing she saw when she opened her eyes was the cold face of the stone walls. The only human trace was the distant hymns she heard during the weekly religious services. She was not allowed to step through the church door. Behind iron bars, in the shadow of the guards, she only listened to the sounds. The echo of the praying people was more than a memory to her now. In 1779, a small change entered her silence. She was moved to a new cell. This time, there was a small window, through which only a few pale lines of light filtered in. She saw daylight for the first time after 11 years, but even that light did not belong to her. She was still chained. She had no visitors, no friends, no hope of forgiveness. She spent the rest of her life within those stone walls. When she died on December 9th, 1801, at the age of 71, the end of a life full of wealth, title, and power came in darkness, silence, and oblivion. But Daria's name was not forgotten. She herself had vanished, but the shadow she left behind was etched into Russia's conscience as the symbol of savagery. Saltykova's crimes surpassed even the cruelty Russia was accustomed to. Violence against serfs was commonplace at the time, but Daria had gone beyond even that order. She did not just oppress the people she owned. She tore them apart. Her estate was more like a slaughterhouse than a manor. Her victims were neither rebellious nor criminal. They were just people who were her property, unable to raise their voices. What made her terrible was not only her actions, but the fact that she faced no punishment for them. Modern psychologists would classify her behavior as sadistic psychopathy, lack of empathy, superficial charm, and the satisfaction derived from inflicting pain on others. All signs point to a serial killer hidden behind a noble title. But this is not a story of madness. This is a story of will. Daria chose violence. She preferred cruelty over mercy, and she never regretted it. Her punishment was not for revenge, but for deterrence. She was publicly humiliated, locked in darkness, and slowly turned into the darkest page of history. The downfall of a countess was the awakening of a society. Daria acted alone, yes, but there was an order that gave birth to that monster, nurtured it, and protected it. In 18th century Russia, serfs were breathing property. Nobles were treated as God's representatives on earth. There was no oversight, no limits, no punishment. If a master beat his servant for a mistake, no one saw it as a crime. Cruelty was part of the order, but Daria exceeded that order. She killed for pleasure, not fear. She was a woman who saw herself as absolute power in the silence of God. And the eyes of the state chose not to look at this horror for years. Officials took bribes, priests prayed, but remained silent. No one was left to stop her. That is why Daria's trial was not just an individual punishment. It was society confronting its own conscience. For the first time, an empire asked itself these questions. How much power can a human carry? And who will stop that power? Saltykova died, but her name lived on. In poems, in rumors, in horror stories. Her story was not just about a killer, but about how unchecked power corrupts a human being. Years later, other names, other faces emerged. In different eras, in the same shadow. Cruel nobles, ruthless commanders, dictators. They all did the same thing. They crushed the powerless because they could. But Daria's story was not a story of war. It cannot be explained by ideology or hunger. She did it only because she had the power to do. And this made her the most terrifying thing in history. The darkness that a human turns into oneself. For every year Daria Saltykova spent in her dark cell, there are dozens of victims who had already died. Most of their names were buried deep in history, just as the system that tormented them tried to erase them. They were serfs, servants, children, women. Their only crime was being born on the wrong estate. They had no graves, no justice they deserved, no way to make their voices heard. But they mattered. Every broken body, every silent scream rising behind the stone walls, reminds us of what happens when we fail to protect the weak. Daria's cell in the Ivanovsky monastery was not just a punishment. It was a warning that even power has limits. Catherine the Great had delivered her message clearly, and Russia never forgot it. 2 centuries later, Daria Saltykova's story still chills people, not only with its horror, but with the lesson it carries. She was not a creature of the shadows, nor a secret monster. She walked in the sunlight, prayed in churches, wore silk dresses, and spoke politely in the palace. She inspired admiration, instilled fear, and was hidden in plain sight. She reminds us of this. Evil does not always come in rags. Sometimes it is adorned with silks and jewels. Sometimes it signs treaties, hosts feasts. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters live in palaces. Daria Saltykova was not an accident. She is the product of a society that viewed humans as animals, prioritized wealth over morality, and ignored the screams of the powerless. Her story is not only a tale of massacre, but a story of warning. Because when power goes unchecked, when cruelty is rewarded with silence, and when justice is delayed due to status, history repeats itself and monsters reemerge.